The morning Daniel Cole stopped being invisible began the way most catastrophic mornings do, quietly and with the smell of something wrong. He had been cleaning the 71st floor of Harlow Tower for 11 months without anyone learning his name. Not the attorneys on the 32nd floor who left their coffee cups balanced on document stacks worth seven figures. Not the engineering consultants on 44 who debated load tolerances over takeout containers they never bothered to throw away. Not the executives on 71 who moved through his presence the way water moves around a stone, and acknowledging the obstacle just enough to avoid it, never enough to see it. 11 months of marble hallways and polished glass and the faint chemical smell of industrial cleaner that had permanently embedded itself into the back of his sinuses, and Daniel had perfected the particular art of existing in a space without occupying it. He had come to understand that invisibility was not a thing that happened to a person. It was a thing a person chose and then practiced until the choosing became invisible too. He was good at it, better than he had any right to be given where he had started. There is a version of the story where Daniel Cole's life followed the trajectory it was designed for: two tours in Afghanistan, a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, and then a return to civilian engineering that made the kind of structural sense he had always found comforting. He had spent 6 years at Shelton and Walsh Engineering in San Francisco as a structural engineer, the kind of work that required you to hold the weight of other people's lives in your calculations and not flinch at the responsibility. He had been good at that too. He had been good at a great many things before the morning on Highway 1 3 years ago, when a California Highway Patrol officer knocked on the door of the house he shared with his wife Claire and their 5-year-old daughter Lily, and used the word accident in a way that landed in Daniel's chest like a load-bearing wall collapsing from the inside. He pushed that thought the way he pushed it every morning, not away exactly, but sideways into the peripheral space where it could exist without swallowing the rest of the day. He had Lily to think about. He had a floor to clean. The cart rolled smooth and quiet through the pre-dawn corridor wheels, freshly oiled the night before because Daniel did not believe in making unnecessary noise. The hallway stretched ahead of him in the particular twilight that belonged to this hour, not dark enough to be night, not light enough to be morning, existing in the in-between the way Daniel had learned to exist in the in-between. Floor-to-ceiling windows ran along the eastern wall. San Francisco spread below them like a circuit board. Someone had left the power on an overnight. All those small lights marking small lives going about their business in the dark. On the opposite wall, a gallery of framed portraits lined the corridor with the self-assurance of men who had never once considered the possibility that the world might not remember them. Past CEOs of Harlow Technology rendered in oil paint, with the particular dignity that expensive portraiture confers on anyone willing to sit still long enough. Daniel had walked past them 400 and something mornings now, and he still checked the fourth one every time. Not because he admired it, because the man in the fourth portrait had the same jawline as his father-in-law, and every morning he was vaguely surprised to confirm it was not actually him. He checked doors as he moved down the corridor. Not out of curiosity, out of habit, so deeply written into his muscle memory that it operated below conscious thought, the same subroutine that used to scan rooftops and alleyways and the faces of children standing too still in market squares. A combat engineer did not stop mapping his environment just because the environment changed. The threat calculus shifted. The vigilance remained. Room 1 locked. Room 2 locked. Room 3, the small conference room where the senior directors argued about quarterly projections, locked. Room 4, the one they called the summit, the crown jewel of the executive floor, with its panoramic views and its imported hardwood table that had absorbed more corporate anxiety per square foot than any piece of furniture had a right to. The door was open, not standing open, not thrown back on its hinges. Hey, barely a crack of interior light spilling into the corridor, thin as a paper cut, but open. The summit was never open before 7. The security protocol was explicit, and Daniel knew every protocol on this floor, the way he knew the wear patterns in the marble, not because anyone had told him, but because 11 months of close observation had taught him more about how this building operated than most of the people who worked in it would ever bother to learn. He stopped the cart. The instinct that stopped him was not curiosity. It was the same instinct that had once made him halt a 4-vehicle convoy on a dirt road outside Kandahar, because something in the geometry of the drainage ditch on the left shoulder was 2 inches deeper than a drainage ditch had any reason to be. The instinct had no language. It was purely physical, a cooling in the blood, a particular quality of stillness spreading outward from the base of the skull. He had learned over 2 tours and 4 years of living with the aftermath of those tours that the instinct was almost always right, and that ignoring it for the sake of appearing normal was a category of cowardice he could not afford. He left the cart where it was and moved to the side of the corridor close enough to the wall that the door's limited sightline would not pick him up. Through the gap, he could see the interior of the summit in fragments, the long conference table, the credenza along the far wall, the eastern windows now turning the faintest shade of gray as the city below began its daily renegotiation with the dark. And standing at those windows, motionless as the portraits in the hall outside Margaret Harlow. He had seen her exactly 7 times in 11 months, and each time, the experience had been roughly equivalent to standing close to a high-voltage transmission line. Not dangerous exactly, but unmistakably charged. She was 38 years old and had been CEO of Harlow Technology for 4 years, and in that time the company's stock price had tripled, while 2 of their primary competitors had consolidated down to one, and the remaining one had spent 18 months explaining to analysts why their numbers looked the way they did. The financial press called her relentless. The employees who worked directly under her called her fair, which in a corporation of this size was a more meaningful compliment than any superlative. Daniel had formed his own impression from the only vantage point available to him, the peripheral, the marginal, the view from the cart, and what he had concluded was that Margaret Harlow carried the weight of the company the way a suspension bridge cable carries load, not by resisting it, but by being precisely calibrated to handle it, every force accounted, for every tension distributed with mathematical exactness. She was standing at the window now in the kind of stillness that only comes from being alone with a problem you have not yet solved. Her jacket was charcoal gray, her hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who considered appearance a form of communication rather than vanity, and her hands were clasped behind her back in the posture of a woman taking inventory of something large. She had not slept. He could tell from 20 feet away and through a 2-inch gap in a door that she had not slept because he recognized that particular quality of stillness. It was the stillness of a body that had given up on rest and redirected all available resources to the problem at hand. She was here before 5 in the morning because a $340 million infrastructure deal with the city of Houston, Texas was scheduled to close in 6 days, and every number in the proposal was right, and something still felt wrong in the way that things feel wrong to people who have learned to trust the computation that runs below the conscious one. Margaret Harlow did not believe in intuition as a professional concept. She believed in pattern recognition, which was the same thing described without the mystical framing, and the pattern her mind had been assembling for 72 hours had not yet resolved into a conclusion she could act on. He was about to move away. She was entitled to her pre-dawn solitude, and whatever she was working through at this hour was none of his business, when the sound of the interior door stopped him. The interior door connected the summit directly to the executive suite, bypassing the main corridor. It opened from the COO's office. Daniel knew this because he had cleaned around that door 400 and something times and had never once seen it open at this hour. Ryan Calloway came through it carrying a small tray. Daniel knew Ryan the way he knew most of the executives on this floor, by observation, by pattern, by the accumulated data of 11 months watching a person move through a space without ever being introduced to them. Ryan Calloway was 45, well-built in the careful way of a man who managed his appearance as a professional asset, and he carried himself with the easy authority of someone who had occupied his position long enough that the position had started to feel like an extension of his body. He had been Meg Harlow's COO since she took over the company, and the floor treated him with the specific deference reserved for people who functioned as the right hand of someone more powerful than themselves. He was carrying a tray with a single cup on it, the imported coffee Margaret Harlow kept in the executive break room. Daniel recognized the particular roast by the color of the ceramic and the way the steam moved. The first thing Daniel noticed was the way Ryan set the tray down. It was a small motion and a natural one, and it would have been unremarkable except for the speed of it. He placed the cup and then his hands withdrew. Not relaxed, not casual, but quick. Too quick. The hands of a man who had decided in advance that he did not want the cup to register as something he had been holding. The second thing was the step back. 2 full steps, putting the width of the table between himself in the position where Margaret Harlow would have to stand to reach the cup. It was the instinctive geometry of a person who wanted distance between themselves and a consequence. The third thing was his face. Daniel had an engineer's instinct for structural integrity, for the point at which a material began to fail under load, and what he saw in the left corner of Ryan Calloway's mouth was the micro-expression of a structure under exactly the stress it had been designed to withstand. Not guilt, not fear. Something colder and more deliberate than either of those, the controlled expression of a man watching for an outcome he already knew was coming. Daniel had seen that expression before, on the face of a translator who had walked a patrol into a prepared position, on the face of the insurance investigator who had declared the brake failure in Claire's car a mechanical accident in under 48 hours without waiting for the independent analysis, without following half the standard protocols, and who had looked at Daniel across a conference table with the polished composure of a man who had been specifically briefed on what conclusions he was expected to reach. The cup was an inch from Margaret Harlow's lips. He moved through the door without deciding to. His voice came out of him before conscious thought could moderate it, stripped of the 11 months of careful calibration he had applied to his own visibility in this building. Don't drink that. The sound landed in the room like a structural failure, sudden total rearranging the load-bearing assumptions of everything around it. Margaret Harlow lowered the cup, slowly, with the precise, deliberate quality of a woman who had trained herself to respond to surprises by slowing down rather than speeding up. Her eyes found Daniel in the doorway, gray eyes sharp as a structural assessment, taking him in with the same systematic efficiency she had just been applying to the city outside her window. Her fingers were white at the knuckles. That was the only evidence of what she was feeling, and it was gone in less than 2 seconds. Ryan Calloway's composure broke for the length of a single frame before reassembling itself into professional concern. He took another step back, and his voice arrived in the careful register of someone modulating urgency into management. Meg, I don't know who this person... She did not look at him. I asked him a question, and then to Daniel in a voice that was the auditory equivalent of a diagnostic test flat, precise, designed to extract information without contaminating the result. Why shouldn't I drink it? There was no good answer to this question that would also make him sound like a person who belonged on this floor. He had no evidence. He had no credentials relevant to this moment. He had an instinct and a piece of knowledge he had carried in the back of his mind since a water source outside a village in Kandahar had been found to contain something that smelled like this, and a dead certainty that was more structural load than conscious thought pressing down on the decision. He told the truth. He was a man who found in this particular moment that he had used up his supply of useful fictions. Bitter almonds. Underneath the dark roast faint something that had no business being in a cup of coffee, the chemical signature of sodium cyanide, which dissolved completely in hot liquid and was almost completely odorless to roughly 40% of the human population. He had learned to identify it in Afghanistan from an army toxicologist who had explained with the patient urgency of someone who considered the information life-critical that the ability to detect it was a genetic trait, and that if you had it, you never forgot the smell. He had it. He had not forgotten it. She could fire him if he was wrong. He would rather be wrong and fired than right and silent. Margaret Harlow held the cup at a precise distance from her mouth, raised it slightly not to drink but to inhale. Her expression did not change, but something in the air of the room shifted in a way Daniel could feel in his sternum. Ryan. She still did not look at him. Where did this coffee come from? The executive break room. His voice had the smoothness of a man who has rehearsed composure until it becomes indistinguishable from the genuine article. Same as always. Meg, this is which is accessible to whom? 5 people. You, me, David Weston, Carol Whitfield, and Sandra. A beat. And apparently building maintenance has access as well. The slight tilt of his head toward Daniel was the most elegant dismissal Daniel had ever been the subject of. We don't. The words came out of Daniel before he had evaluated whether it was wise to keep speaking. The break room runs on a different key card tier. Day shift team cleans it. I've never been inside. She set the cup down on the conference table with the deliberate care of someone placing a piece of evidence. The sound of ceramic on hardwood was the only sound in the room for approximately 3 seconds. Ryan, her voice had dropped half a register, and gain something that was not volume, but occupied the space that volume would have. Call Sandra Pierce, building security. Use the conference room phone. Meg, this is use the conference room phone. He moved to the phone on the far wall, and she turned to Daniel fully, completely, with the focused attention of a woman who had just made the decision to take something seriously. He told her his name. 11 months on this floor, and this was the first time he had said it to anyone above the third tier of building staff. How long have you worked this floor, Mr. Cole? 11 months. And in 11 months, you have learned that the break room is on a separate keyboard tier. Not a question, a data point being filed. When you clean the same building long enough, you learn how it works. She looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it was the look of a person recalibrating a model. Stay on this floor, don't leave the building, don't discuss this with anyone until Sandra gets here. She paused. And if you're right about what's in that cup, I will need to understand how a building services employee recognized sodium cyanide by smell before my head of security did. I'll explain that too. Sandra Pierce arrived in 4 minutes. 54 years old, gray hair cut short with the efficiency of a woman who had decided some time ago that she did not intend to spend significant portions of her life managing hair. She came through the door already reading the room, a skill Daniel recognized from people who had trained in environments where reading a room quickly was not a professional asset, but a survival requirement. She had been head of security at Harlow Technology for 5 years after a career at the FBI that she did not discuss in detail with anyone on the staff. She wore her authority the way structural engineers wore their calculations, not as decoration, but as evidence of what was holding things up. She carried a field kit in the inside pocket of her jacket. Standard procedure she had implemented herself, she would later explain, because she had learned in the federal government that the gap between a preliminary answer and a lab-confirmed answer was the most dangerous window in any threat scenario, and she preferred to close that window as quickly as the available technology permitted. The colorimetric test took 3 minutes. 15 milliliters of the coffee, a reagent strip, a color comparison chart that Sandra read with the practiced calm of someone who had done this before and did not require the result to confirm what she already suspected. She looked up. Positive for cyanide. Preliminary only, I need the full lab analysis, which takes 8 hours. But this is not a false positive. The temperature in the room dropped in the way that rooms drop temperature when a thing that was theoretical becomes factual. Margaret Harlow absorbed the result without visible reaction, which was itself a form of reaction, the specific composure of someone who has just had their worst hypothesis confirmed and is already moving to the next problem. Sandra looked at Daniel for the first time. 2 seconds top to bottom, the assessment of a person who had spent a career evaluating other people's usefulness. You're from building services. Floor 71, 11 months. A pause. The slight tilt of a head that people make when they are revising their category for something. Good instincts, Cole. It was the second time in 6 minutes that someone had called him by his last name, and he was aware that it carried a different weight from Sandra than it had from any of the building supervisors who had used it over the past 11 months. It was the weight of one professional acknowledging another, the kind of acknowledgement that does not require an explanation of credentials because the action has already provided them. Ryan Calloway had remained by the conference room phone, maintaining his position with the stillness of a man who has decided that stillness is his best available strategy. Sandra turned to him with a particular quality of attention that made everything it landed on feel examined. Mr. Calloway, I'll need to ask you to wait in your office while we process the scene. Standard protocol for anyone in the room prior to the discovery. This is my building too. The resistance arrived faster than calculation could have produced it. Margaret Harlow said his name. Just his name, Ryan, in the flat, precise tone of a woman who had learned that the most efficient way to end a conversation was to reduce her vocabulary to a single word and let the weight of context carry the rest. He went. The door closed, and in the silence that followed, Daniel became aware that he was standing in the summit, a room he had cleaned several hundred times, a room in which decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars had been made while he worked quietly around the edges of the conversations, invisible as always, and that this time he was not invisible at all. Sandra moved with systematic efficiency, securing the cup in an evidence bag she produced from the same jacket pocket as the field kit. because Sandra Pierce was a person who carried the tools of multiple contingencies simultaneously. She photographed the position of the tray, the cup, the surface of the table. She spoke quietly into her earpiece, coordinating her team. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead, and Daniel recognized the quality because he had worked with people like her before, in a different context, in a different country, where thinking 3 steps ahead was not a professional competency, but the margin between living and not. Miss Harlow, Sandra's voice had the specific gentleness of a person delivering information to someone who needed to hear it clearly. Until we have the full analysis and a clearer picture of the source, I'd recommend moving to the secure conference room on 70. No more open-door meetings. Nobody in your immediate space without my personal clearance. I have a board meeting in 90 minutes. I know. I'm asking about after. The two women held each other's gaze for a moment, in the particular language of people who have both learned to hold things together under pressure and recognize that quality in each other. Then Meg nodded once and turned to Daniel. She had her phone in her hand. He could see the screen, the Harlow Technology Employee Directory, his own profile pulled up with the efficiency of a woman who did not waste motion on anything, including the establishment of context. Silver Star, Purple Heart, 2 tours, structural engineer at Shelton and Walsh for 6 years. Wife deceased 3 years prior. 1 daughter, age 8. Mr. Cole. The board meeting was in 88 minutes now, and she was using the one she had. Before I walk into that room and spend 3 hours pretending everything is normal, I need to understand what I'm walking away from. You knew what was in that cup. You've cleaned this floor for 11 months without anyone noticing you, or the fact that you're considerably more than your employment record suggests. And Shelton and Walsh, which is currently our primary engineering contractor for a $340 million infrastructure deal with the city of Houston, appears in your work history as the place your career ended. She was not asking permission to say any of this. She was establishing coordinates. Walk me through that last part. The truthful version was not a short story, but she had asked for it directly, and Daniel had found in the last 15 minutes that the careful architecture of evasion he had maintained for 3 years had developed a structural crack he could not repair in time to be useful here. He gave her the outline. Not the full weight of it, not yet, not in this room, not with 87 minutes until the board walked in and the world needed to look normal, but enough of the load-bearing elements. He had asked questions at Shelton and Walsh about safety certification practices on a commercial project. The questions had been received as a structural threat rather than a professional inquiry. He had been offered a separation package with a number attached to a non-disclosure agreement, and he had been holding his daughter's hand at the time of the conversation, and Lily was 5 years old and had just lost her mother, and the calculation was not a complicated one. He had signed, he had left, he was here. You know, Shelton and Walsh is connected to the Houston deal. Not a question. Yes. And that's not why you're here. I'm here because the health insurance covers Lily's orthodontist. He held her gaze. That's not a metaphor. It's the actual reason. She was quiet for 3 seconds, the specific silence of a person processing information against a model they are simultaneously revising. I believe you. Then I don't know what it means yet, but I believe you. And there's a certain kind of trust that has nothing to do with history or established relationship or any of the usual scaffolding. It is the trust of 2 people who have, in the space of a single compressed morning, demonstrated to each other how they behave under pressure and discovered that the behavior is recognizable. Daniel had not experienced this particular kind of trust in 3 years. He was aware of it the way a structure is aware of load, not consciously exactly, but in every joint. She stood. Go back to work. Act as you normally would. I'll need to speak with you after the board meeting, the details of what you know about Shelton and Walsh's practices, all of it. But right now, I need to walk into that room looking like the person I was yesterday morning, which means I have 86 minutes to become her. A pause at the door. And Mr. Cole, whatever you heard before you came through that door, and whatever you hear from here forward, while you're working this floor, you report it to Sandra directly, not to anyone else. Are we clear? Clear? She left and the summit was quiet again, and Daniel stood in it for a moment with the particular feeling of a man who has just stepped off a cliff and discovered with genuine surprise that there might be solid ground somewhere below the visible line. He went back to his cart. Meg opened her tablet before reaching her own office, accessing the executive floor security system through her administrative credentials. She had not asked Sandra or Daniel to do this. She had done it herself because she was a person who needed to understand the geometry of a problem from first principles before she trusted anyone else's account of it. The break room access log loaded in 20 seconds. The timestamp at 4:47 a.m. was their clean and indisputable 17 minutes before Ryan's entry at 5:04 recorded on the same system. The credential used was not Ryan's. The camera coverage had a blind spot at the northeast corner of the room precisely where the coffee station was positioned. She pulled up the original camera installation diagram and traced the blind spot's boundaries on her screen with one finger mapping the exact knowledge required to exploit it. This was not improvisation. Someone had studied this room. The board members began arriving at 7:30. Daniel watched them from the corridor, maintaining the careful industry of a man whose job required him to be present without being observed. David Weston was first 70 years old, silver-haired, carrying his authority the way old money carries itself, which is to say without apparent effort, and with the faint expectation that the world would arrange itself appropriately around it. Then Carol Whitfield, 56, who moved with the brisk confidence of a woman accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room she entered. Carol paused at the corridor entrance, and for a moment her eyes moved across the space with a quality that was not quite surveillance but was not quite casual. Either the practiced sweep of someone checking coordinates. Her phone was in her hand before she reached the summit door, and she glanced at the screen twice in the 30 seconds Daniel watched her, with the particular tight quality of attention that a person gives to a message they are expecting and dreading simultaneously. Through the glass panel of the summit door, once it had closed, Daniel could see Margaret Harlow at the head of the table. She was talking. Her hands moved with the measured precision of a conductor who knew exactly what tempo she needed. From this distance, at this angle, through the soundproof glass, she looked like a woman whose most pressing concern was the Houston infrastructure numbers in the Q4 projections, and whatever objection David Weston was raising in that slow, authoritative cadence that his years on the board had distilled into a kind of institutional weather pattern. She looked, in other words, exactly as she needed to look. Daniel had cleaned this floor for 11 months, and he had learned many things. One of them was that the distance between what people appeared to be doing and what they were actually managing was often the most important structural measurement available. He was working his way back toward the cart when Ryan Calloway's warrants reached him from around the corner. Not loud, not intended to carry, but carrying anyway in the particular way of voices that are working hard at being quiet. There isn't more time. The low urgency of the man who has moved past the stage where he can afford careful phrasing. She's starting to ask questions about the contract terms, the Houston terms specifically. If the deal doesn't go through on the original structure, Frank will... A pause. The silence of someone who has caught themselves on the edge of saying more than they intended. Frank won't have any options left. Frank. Daniel stood still. The name landed in his chest with the particular density of something that has been traveling a long distance before it arrives. Frank Shelton. The name Daniel had spent 3 years constructing an entire life around not saying. The man who had sat across a conference table from him 11 days after Claire's funeral and explained with the careful warmth of a person delivering an offer they had calculated he could not refuse, that grief could make a person's professional judgment unreliable, and that the company thought it best to part ways generously and quietly. The CEO of Shelton and Walsh Engineering, whose firm had reviewed Claire's car brake system 14 days before she died, whose insurance investigator had ruled the failure mechanical within 48 hours, whose settlement check had arrived in an envelope with a return address, Daniel had never allowed himself to look up, because looking it up would have meant deciding what to do with the information, and he had not been ready. He was the CEO of the firm that was the primary engineering contractor for Margaret Harlow's most important deal. And his name was being spoken in the corridor of this building in this context on the morning after someone had put sodium cyanide in Margaret Harlow's coffee. Daniel did not believe in coincidence the way he did not believe in structurally unsound materials, not as a matter of philosophy, but as a matter of lived professional experience. Coincidences, like inadequate load calculations, had a way of revealing themselves as something else entirely once you were standing in the failure. He moved back to his cart. He began cleaning the section of marble nearest to the elevator bank, which required no thought, and freed his mind for the arithmetic that was beginning to assemble itself, whether he invited it to or not. Shelton and Walsh needed the Houston deal to survive. Margaret Harlow was the person who controlled whether it went through on terms favorable to the firm. Someone had placed cyanide in her coffee this morning, using access to a room that required a key card held by one of 5 people, one of whom was a board member named Carol Whitfield, who was Frank Shelton's sister. There is a kind of clarity that comes not from new information, but from the sudden loss of the resistance that was keeping existing information from connecting to itself. It is not a pleasant feeling. It has the cold, irreversible quality of a structure settling into its final position after the last support has been removed. The board meeting ended at 11:47. Daniel had cleaned the same section of corridor marble 3 times. He had not spoken to anyone. He had reported via text to the number Sandra Pierce had given him, the fragment of Ryan's conversation, the name, the timing, the phrase won't have any options left. Sandra's response had arrived in 90 seconds noted. Stay on floor. Don't approach Calloway. Margaret Harlow came out of the summit last. She looked by any ordinary metric exactly as she had when she had gone in, composed, precise, moving, with the controlled efficiency of a woman who had meetings scheduled on the other side of this one. But Daniel was not reading her by ordinary metrics. He was reading the small indicators that even the best managed composure cannot entirely suppress after 3 hours of sitting in a room full of people you cannot fully trust anymore, performing the role of a woman who does not know what she knows. She stopped in front of him. The corridor was temporarily empty, board members having dispersed to phones and assistants in the urgent business of whatever came next. Walk with me. It was not a question. It was not quite a command. It was the sentence of a woman who had decided that the most useful next step was a conversation with the one person in this building who had demonstrated in the last several hours that he was telling her the truth. He left the cart and fell into step beside her. They moved past the executive offices, past the break room, now bearing Sandra's yellow evidence tape across the door like a wound the building had not yet processed, and into a smaller conference room that faced west instead of east, the afternoon light coming through at an angle that made the room feel less exposed. She closed the door, and for the first time in the hours since she had lowered that cup from her lips, Margaret Harlow allowed the precise architecture of her composure to show a hairline fracture. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple. She took a single breath that was slightly longer than the ones before it. I just spent 3 hours convincing 11 people that the Houston deal is structurally sound and that our Q4 projections justify the expansion parameters, while knowing that someone put poison in my coffee this morning. Her voice was level, but the level had a quality now, not the trained calm of a boardroom, but the particular steadiness of a person holding something together through will alone. I don't know if that makes me very good at my psalm or very detached from reality. Possibly both. It makes you someone who knows how to survive. He held her gaze. That's different from either of those things. She looked at him with the sharp focus of someone who has just heard an unexpected answer and is recalibrating the conversation accordingly. You sound like a person who knows what that costs. Everyone knows what surviving costs. Some of us just get more practice than others. She moved to the window and looked out at the afternoon city below. From here, San Francisco had the deceptive tidiness of height, all those complex, difficult lives reduced to geometry and light. She was quiet for a moment, and Daniel understood that the quiet was not emptiness, but the particular density of a person with too many calculations running simultaneously. Sandra found something. She did not turn from the window. The security footage from the executive break room. There is a shadow at 4:47 this morning, 17 minutes before Ryan brought me the coffee. The figure knows exactly where the camera blind spots are, which means we are not dealing with opportunism. We are dealing with planning. And the blind spot knowledge requires internal familiarity with our security system. Yes. She turned now. The break room key card access is held by 5 people: myself, Ryan, David Weston, Carol Whitfield, and Sandra. A pause. Carol Whitfield is Frank Shelton's sister. The confirmation of what he had already assembled hit him differently when she said it. It had the specific weight of a structural diagnosis being confirmed, The satisfaction of the analysis proving accurate overlaid by the cold factual gravity of what the accuracy means. There is a line that separates the moment when you know something from the moment when knowing it becomes your problem. Daniel had crossed that line somewhere between the corridor and this room, and he was aware enough of the territory to understand there was no crossing back. He had spent 3 years believing that the safest thing he could do for Lily was to be the kind of man that nobody looked at twice. A man with no outstanding grievances, no unresolved questions, no visible connection to anything that powerful people might need to manage. He had taken the settlement money and the non-disclosure agreement and the quiet transfer of himself and his 5-year-old daughter to the part of San Francisco where nobody from Shelton and Walsh attended the same school pickup lines or the same grocery stores. He had rebuilt himself around the negative space of everything he had been before, not moving forward exactly, but constructing a kind of stillness that he had told himself was protection. He had been wrong about that. He understood it now, with the clarity of a man who can see the structural flaw in retrospect because the failure has already begun. Mr. Cole, she was watching him with the gray assessment that he had come to understand was not coldness, but precision, the visual equivalent of a structural calculation. Whatever happened at Shelton and Walsh that ended your career there, I need to know if it is connected to what happened this morning. Not because I can promise it will stay controlled, but because walking into this without the full load capacity is how structures fail. I know. He looked at the tray in his hands, a replacement roll of paper towels he had picked up from the cart before following her in here. The prop of his former invisibility now feeling like something he was carrying for a completely different reason. The story I told you this morning was the short version, the version where I made a choice that made sense at the time and then lived with it. Tell me the version that connects to this morning. I don't know yet that it connects. He met her eyes. But when I heard Ryan say Frank Shelton's name in that corridor, something in the load path changed. And the engineering principle that's relevant here is that when the load path changes in a structure you thought you understood, you don't assume everything is still standing. You check. She was quiet for a moment that had the texture of genuine consideration rather than strategic pause. Then, after the board meeting, I had our CFO pull the financial statements for Shelton and Walsh. The firm is carrying $47 million in concealed losses. They're 18 months from insolvency without the Houston contract. She said it the way she would have said it in a board presentation, factually cleanly, without the weight of what it implied. Frank Shelton didn't try to kill me because he was desperate. He tried to kill me because he had done the same arithmetic you just did and concluded that my removal was load-bearing to his survival. The word removal landed between them with all the weight it carried. He thought of Lily, who was at school right now with Mrs. Reeves scheduled to pick her up at 3, who had been drawing suspension bridges at the kitchen table last night and asking her father whether the cables or the towers were more important, who had pressed a stuffed bear into his hands this morning with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a child who had learned that the people she loved sometimes needed tangible evidence that someone was paying attention to their safety. You do not keep a person safe by disappearing. You do not protect your daughter from the thing that took her mother by making yourself small enough that no one notices you. You protect her by standing between her and the thing which requires first being willing to be seen. I'll tell you all of it, he said. Tonight or whenever you need it. Everything I know about Shelton and Walsh's practices, what happened to Claire, the questions I was asking before they paid me to stop. He held her gaze. But I need something first. Name it. My daughter gets protection. Quiet, nothing that frightens her. She's 8 years old and she's already carrying more than an 8-year-old should have to carry. I won't add fear to it. The response came without hesitation, which told him something about who this woman was underneath the architecture of her public self. Sandra will arrange it, a driver discreet starting with this afternoon's pickup, whatever resources are necessary. She extended her hand and he shook it, and the handshake had the specific quality of an agreement between two people who have both learned through considerable cost that a promise means exactly as much as the person making it. She left for her next meeting. Daniel returned to his cart. The afternoon light was shifting through the eastern windows out the city below, beginning its negotiation with the coming dark, and Daniel Cole pushed his cart down the corridor of the 71st floor of Harlow Tower with the particular knowledge of a man who has just made a decision that cannot be unmade. The question that lived in the space behind his sternum, the one that had been living there for 3 years, that he had worked very hard at not asking out loud, had just become the most structurally relevant question in the building. And somewhere in this city, in a firm that had paid for his silence and buried the investigation into his wife's death, a man named Frank Shelton was in the process of discovering that his plan had not worked. That was Daniel understood the most dangerous moment in any structural failure. Not the collapse itself, the moment just before when the thing that was supposed to hold everything together realizes it isn't going to. Lily was waiting by the school gate when Marcus Webb pulled the black sedan to the curb, and the first thing she did when Daniel stepped out was study his face with the unhurried thoroughness of a child who has learned that what adults say and what their faces report are frequently different documents. She was 8 years old and carried her backpack the way she carried most burdens, slightly too large for her frame adjusted for, managed without complaint. She ran to him and he caught her, and she smelled like the strawberry shampoo she had chosen herself at the drugstore 3 weeks ago, and the faint chalk dust smell of a school day well used, and for the length of that embrace, the 71st floor and the poisoned cup and the name Frank Shelton existed somewhere at a significant remove. Then she pulled back and looked at him again. Dangerous kind or careful kind? He had not said anything yet. He had simply picked her up from school on a Tuesday afternoon when she knew his schedule and knew this was not on it. She had already done the arithmetic. Careful kind, he told her, which means I'm handling it. Mrs. Reeves made snickerdoodles. She considered this information in relation to everything else she was reading off him. You should probably have some. Marcus drove them home through the Tuesday afternoon traffic of the Sunset District, while Lily described a classroom debate about whether bridges or tunnels were more impressive feats of engineering, a debate she had clearly won on the merits, and was now reconstructing for his benefit with the forensic pleasure of a natural advocate. She wanted his technical opinion on her argument that a suspension bridge was essentially a solved problem in tension redistribution, while a tunnel through unstable substrate required continuous improvisation. He told her she was right. She received this with the satisfaction of someone who already knew but appreciated the confirmation. At home, while she worked through snickerdoodles and a reading assignment at the kitchen table, Daniel stood at the counter and made a call to Sandra Pierce. He kept his voice at the level of a man ordering a delivery. He told her about the fragment of Ryan's conversation, the fuller details beyond what he had texted, the specific quality of the urgency in Ryan's voice, the weight of the phrase, no options left. Sandra was quiet for 4 seconds in the way of a person cataloging rather than absorbing. She told him to come in the following morning and at 7:30. She told him Marcus Webb would be in the parking lot of the school at 2:50 tomorrow, regardless of where Daniel was. She told him to get some sleep with a flatness that suggested she knew he would not. After Lily was in bed after the reading and the glass of water and the brief negotiation about whether the nightlight needed to be on, it did and had for 3 years, and Daniel no longer assigned any meaning to this, except that 8-year-olds were entitled to whatever light they needed. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had made from a sealed container he had purchased that afternoon from a grocery store 2 blocks away. He checked the seal before opening it. He was aware of checking the seal. He was also aware that this was going to be his life for a while, and that the awareness itself was the price of paying attention. The photograph he carried in his breast pocket was face down on the table in front of him. He had not placed it there consciously. His hands had done it while his mind was somewhere else, which was its own kind of testimony about where his mind had been all day. Claire had been 36 when she died, 11 months younger than Daniel, and she had possessed the particular quality of directness that made everyone who encountered her feel that she was paying attention specifically to them and that she expected them to do the same in return. She had been a project manager at an architecture firm, not an engineer, but she had understood load distribution and structural integrity the way some non-musicians understand music intuitively and well enough to catch the errors that formal training sometimes missed. It was how they had met. She had flagged a specification inconsistency in a mixed-use development he was consulting on 3 days before the relevant section of framing went in, and he had driven to her office to understand how she had caught what his team had missed. He had stayed 2 hours. He had come back the following week with no professional justification whatsoever. He turned the photograph face up. She was laughing at something outside the frame in the backyard of the house they no longer lived in in the particular angled afternoon light of an October 2 years before Lily was born. The photograph had survived everything. The move, the settlement, the period of approximately 4 months in which Daniel had operated on the thinnest margin of functional capacity he had ever experienced, including 2 combat deployments. It had survived because Lily had found it in a box and asked if she could put it on the refrigerator, and he had said yes because there was no version of himself capable of saying anything else. He put it back in his pocket. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the building settle around him and did not sleep for a long time. Sandra Pierce's office occupied a corner of the security suite on the 14th floor and had the organized density of a space that functioned as a command center rather than a workplace. By the time Daniel arrived at 7:30 the following morning, she had been there for at least 2 hours. The evidence was distributed across the desk with professional economy, 3 open laptops, a printed timeline marked in 3 colors, a coffee that was already its own second iteration. The role she outlined was specific and bounded in the way that only people who have worked in institutional frameworks with clear liability understand. Technical consultant, temporary designation, reporting directly to her. His function was the analysis of physical evidence from an engineering standpoint, the kind of structural and materials knowledge that her team did not carry. He was not an investigator. He had no enforcement authority. He was not to conduct independent inquiries, approach persons of interest, or share information outside their working group. He was to observe, analyze, and report. He accepted these terms because they were reasonable and because Sandra Pierce was clearly a person who had spent a career inside systems where reasonable terms kept people alive, and he was not in a position to argue with that track record. She showed him the security footage. The timestamp read 4:47 a.m. The figure moved at the edge of the frame with the specific quality of someone who has studied the camera positions and planned their path accordingly, not hurried, not furtive, but deliberate in the way of a person executing a sequence they have rehearsed. The blind spot near the coffee station swallowed them completely for 93 seconds. Then they were gone. Ryan Calloway's entry log shows him badging into the building at 4:52, Sandra said. He goes to his office, stays there 11 minutes, then enters the break room at 5:03. She pulled up the second timestamp side by side. Our figure in the blind spot has a different build profile, different gait pattern, different shoulder width. Ryan is 6'1". This individual is closer to 5'10" and 5'11". Daniel studied the footage with the patience of a man who had spent years reading subtle structural indicators and understood that the most important information was often in what was not visible. The way the figure moved to the blind spot without hesitation, the specific angle of approach, the knowledge required to execute that path without rehearsal in a space you were not supposed to be in before 5 in the morning. They've been in that room before, he said, during normal hours. This isn't navigation under pressure, it's recall, which limits our pool. Sandra let the implications sit without filling it. The 5 key card holders are the obvious frame, but key cards can be borrowed. They can be taken without the holder's knowledge. She paused. Carol Whitfield keeps a spare in her home office. The board meeting had resumed its normal schedule by 8. Daniel took up his position on the floor with the equipment that had been his cover for 11 months now, serving a different function. He was a man with a cleaning cart and a security badge clipped to his belt that nobody had asked about yet, watching a corridor in which people moved with the confident purposefulness of persons who had somewhere to be, and no particular reason to examine the man maintaining the floor they were walking on. Ryan Calloway appeared at 8:45, moving from his office toward the executive suite with his phone in his hand and his face arranged in the careful neutral of a man managing several things simultaneously. He passed Daniel without acknowledging him, which was normal, and Daniel watched the set of his shoulders as he walked, a tightness that had not been there in the months before yesterday, a quality of carrying weight that was not visible in the posture but was present in the gait the way a structure carries load before it shows visible deflection. At 9, Sandra called him to the 14th floor. The meeting in the 14th floor conference room was the first time Ryan Calloway encountered Sandra Pierce across a table in her official capacity, and the encounter clarified several things simultaneously. Sandra had placed the phone records in the center of the table without preamble, 47 calls in 30 days between Ryan's personal cell and a number registered to Frank Shelton's private line, distributed through evenings and weekends, with the pattern of a social relationship rather than a professional one. Ryan's response was the response of a man who had spent the intervening hours constructing a position. He and Frank Shelton played golf. They had for years. Frank had been under pressure about the business, and Ryan had listened because that was what friends did, and what he had heard was a man worried about financial performance, not a man planning anything. He had not disclosed the relationship to Meg because there was nothing to disclose. Personal friendships with contractors were not unusual in their industry, and he had kept his professional judgment entirely separate. Meg Harlow sat at the end of the table and listened to this with the particular quality of attention she brought to financial projections, not reactive deeply, analytical, measuring what was being said against the architecture of what she already knew. When Ryan finished, she was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, the words arrived with the deliberate precision of a person who has decided that clarity is more useful than kindness. You knew Frank Shelton was in financial trouble. You knew the extent of it. You told me you play golf with the man, which means you've seen the club membership fees and the equipment and the way people talk when the money is real versus when the money is performance. You knew I was signing a contract with his firm worth $340 million, and you said nothing. She held his gaze with the unflinching attention of someone who has passed through shock and arrived at something harder on the other side. The loyalty that does not require honesty is not loyalty. It's just a more comfortable word for the same betrayal. Ryan's composure held, but it held the way a surface holds when the substrate beneath it is beginning to shift visibly, maintaining something that was no longer naturally stable. He understood in this room that his position was not the one he had constructed it to be, in the preparation he had done overnight, and that understanding moved through his face in the way of a man processing the distance between what he thought he had done and what he had actually done. I didn't know about any poison. The statement had the quality of something true being offered as partial mitigation for something larger. Whatever Frank was planning, I was not part of it. I know. Meg said it with the flat certainty of someone who has already run that analysis and reached that conclusion and filed it under a category separate from the one currently in front of her. But you understand why you're going to spend the next several days demonstrating that to Sandra's satisfaction rather than mine. Sandra reviewed the footage analysis with Ryan after Meg left. The conclusion that the figure at 447 was not him visibly reconfigured something in his posture. He had been carrying the possibility of being the primary suspect the way a person carries a thing they know is wrong, but cannot yet disprove, and the removal of it left him looking not vindicated, but exhausted in the way that people look when fear is replaced by the ordinary gravity of the situation that remains. Someone used Carol Whitfield's spare key card. Sandra laid it out with the economy of a person who does not editorialize during the relevant portion of an analysis. Whether Carol knew or didn't know is the next question. The question after that is how Frank Shelton knew your coffee schedule well enough to time a delivery that depended on Ryan arriving early and finding Meg already in the building. Ryan absorbed this in silence. Then, he asked me once, maybe 6 weeks ago, whether Meg came in early during high-pressure deal periods. I told him she sometimes did. He said it to the table rather than to Sandra. I thought it was small talk about how hard she worked. This was the specific mechanism of how decent people become useful to terrible ones, not through agreement, but through the ordinary commerce of friendly conversation, the 1,000 small informational exchanges that constitute a working relationship, none of them individually significant, all of them together providing the material that someone with a plan can use. Daniel had seen this pattern in institutional failures the same way he had seen it in structural ones. The damage is rarely the result of a single catastrophic choice. It is the accumulated consequence of many small choices that each seemed reasonable in isolation. The afternoon brought the news about James Holt. Mrs. Reeves had mentioned her nephew perhaps 3 months earlier, in the context of a conversation about careers that did not go as planned. Her nephew had been an engineer in San Francisco, had some trouble with a company, moved to Portland to start over. Daniel had cataloged the information and filed it in the peripheral memory that engineers maintain for potentially relevant data and had not accessed it since. The morning's arithmetic, however, had retrieved it without his permission. He texted Sandra. She responded in 14 minutes with a confirmation, James Holt, 35, Portland, Oregon. Structural engineer, former Shelton and Walsh employee, litigation records showing a lawsuit filed in 2021, and settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement attached. Current employment at a small equipment company well below his credential level. Sandra called him directly from the security office. She had spoken to a whistleblower protection attorney in Portland, an arrangement she described as one she had maintained for years in the understanding that it would eventually be relevant to something. The attorney could provide James Holt with a preemptive legal framework, immunity from NDA enforcement, in exchange for cooperation before Holt said a single word to anyone. The offer would have to be made in person to be credible. Daniel said he could be in Portland by 7 in the evening if they could arrange a flight. There's a private airfield in San Mateo. I use it for sensitive transport. Sandra's voice had the specific quality of a person activating a resource they have maintained precisely for moments like this. Sarah Vance goes with you, former Secret Service currently consulting for me. She is not a person who makes problems larger than they already are. The hardest part of that afternoon was not the logistics. The hardest part was the conversation with Lily. He picked her up at the usual time in the same sedan, with Marcus at the wheel maintaining the ordinary appearance of an ordinary school day. He waited until they were home and she had eaten the apple she always ate immediately after school and deposited her backpack with the particular violence that second-grade homework assignments sometimes warranted. Then he sat across from her at the kitchen table and did not use the version of this conversation that involved a business trip and a vague professional necessity. She deserved the version that was true. "Daddy is going to Portland tonight," he said. "Just for one night. I'll be back before school tomorrow." She was already reading him. He could see it in the careful stillness she adopted when she was processing. "Is it about what happened at work yesterday?" "Partly." He held her gaze. "And it might be about something that happened before. Something about Mom." The stillness deepened. She picked up her apple core and put it down again. "Mom's accident." "I'm not sure it was an accident." He said it the way he had never said it before out loud to her, without the protective scaffolding of an official version. "I've never been sure. I'm going to try to find out." She did not cry. She looked at him with the gray-blue eyes she had inherited from Claire and processed what he had just handed her with a seriousness that was not the seriousness of a child imitating adults, but the genuine gravity of someone receiving information that recontextualizes a significant portion of their experience. "Is it dangerous?" Her voice was steady. It had been steady like this since she was 5, which was when she had learned through the specific education of loss that some situations required steadiness from everyone in the room. "I'm being careful." He leaned forward, "which is different from it being dangerous." She considered this distinction. Then she got up from the table and went to her room and came back with the stuffed bear, a thing of faded brown fleece, and one repaired ear, the companion of every night since she was 2 years old, and set it on the table in front of him. "Take this, so you remember to come back." He put it in his jacket pocket. It was not a small thing, and it made the pocket misshapen, and he did not care about that in the slightest. The flight to Portland took 90 minutes in a 6-seat aircraft that smelled of upholstery and commercial-grade disinfectant and moved through the coastal cloud layer with the steady indifference of a thing that has crossed this particular distance enough times to have no feelings about it. Sarah Vance occupied the seat across from him with the compact, watchful stillness of a professional whose baseline state was alert. She had short hair and the kind of physical presence that registered without demanding acknowledgement, and she had said approximately 40 words since they had been introduced in the parking lot of the San Mateo airfield, all of them useful. He spent the flight reading the documents Sandra had compiled, the public record of James Holt's lawsuit, the settlement terms that had been scrubbed of their specific language, but not their shape, the engineering license records that showed a man who had passed his professional examinations with exceptional scores and had not renewed his certification since 2022. The pattern of a person who had been removed from the thing they were qualified for and had stopped trying to return to it. Portland was raining in the particular determined way of a city that has made its peace with moisture. The attorney's office was on the 5th floor of a building near the waterfront that had the particular atmosphere of a space designed to feel safe to people who had reason to need safety. Good locks. No glass walls facing public corridors. A reception area that was empty at this hour because the arrangements had been specific about the time. The attorney's name was David Park, 30-something, with the careful manner of someone who understood that his clients came to him in states of considerable stress and that a calm voice in the room was a professional asset. James Holt was already there when they arrived. He was 35 years old and looked like a man who had been carrying something for several years and had gotten good enough at carrying it that the weight no longer showed in the obvious places but had found the less obvious ones instead. He was thin in the manner of people who forget to eat when they are thinking hard, and he had the engineer's habit of looking at the structural features of rooms rather than their decorative ones. When Daniel came through the door, Holt looked at him for a long moment with an expression that mixed something like recognition with something like relief, the specific relief of a person who has been waiting for a conversation they could not initiate themselves. The attorney's preamble was brief and specific. James Holt's NDA covered specific project details and proprietary company information. It did not, under federal whistleblower protection statutes, a fact the attorney laid out with the patient precision of someone who had spent considerable time on this particular legal architecture, prohibit him from discussing industry standards, professional ethical obligations, or the general practices of a firm in the context of a federal investigation. The immunity agreement he had signed 30 minutes before Daniel arrived covered everything else. What James Holt told them over the next 90 minutes had the quality of a thing that had been held under pressure for so long that its release was not dramatic, but simply structural, the straightforward consequence of the containing walls finally giving way. 17 safety inspection reports falsified over 8 months. The specific mechanism completion deadlines on a commercial development in the South of Market District had been set before the substrate analysis was complete, and the timeline allowed no room for the legitimate inspection cycle. The instructions had come through a project manager who had received them from Frank Shelton directly, and they had been delivered in the particular register of corporate direction that maintains plausible deniability by never using the word falsify, only efficiency, only timeline, only what do we need to do to get this signed off. Holt had signed off because he was 29 years old and had been at the company for 14 months and had been told in terms that were not ambiguous despite their professional dressing that the engineers who succeeded at Shelton and Walsh were the ones who understood that the company's reputation for delivery was the foundation on which all their other reputations rested. He had signed because he had not yet developed the full architecture of what he would later understand he believed, and by the time he had developed it, the signing was already done. When he had gone to HR and disclosed what he had done, they had thanked him for his transparency and placed him on administrative leave while they reviewed his files. The review had produced a curated version of his work history, not fabricated from nothing but selectively assembled from legitimate mistakes every engineer makes early in their career, arranged to suggest a pattern of incompetence, rather than the isolated ethical failure of a person who had made a specific terrible choice under institutional pressure. By the time the leave period ended, Shelton and Walsh had a documented case that could survive scrutiny, and Holt had a choice between fighting it, which would have required disclosing the falsification, which carried its own criminal exposure, or accepting the settlement and beginning somewhere else entirely. Daniel listened to this with the specific patience of a man who recognizes in another person's story about the structural elements of his own. The mechanism was identical. The documentation of performance failure as a preemptive defense. The settlement offer calibrated precisely to the calculation that the person receiving it could not afford to refuse the NDA as the load-bearing wall of the entire arrangement. Before I signed, Holt said, I read everything they sent me. All of it. I was trying to find the lever that would let me push back. He looked at his hands on the table. There was an email chain, internal, from the corporate server, which I still had access to because the IT lockout had a 2-day lag. He paused. The subject line was a project reference code I didn't recognize, but the body of the email contained an action item. 3 words handle the coal situation. The temperature in the room did something that was not reducible to HV ASO. The sender was Frank Shelton, Holt continued. The recipient was Garrett Willis, a guy on the facilities and maintenance side, not someone I'd interacted with professionally. The date was 9 days before the accident on Highway 1. He met Daniel's eyes directly now in the way of someone who has decided that the only remaining obligation is honesty. I didn't know who Cole was when I saw it. I found out afterward, after the accident was reported. After I saw the name in the news. A long breath. I signed the NDA 6 days after that, and I have thought about that sequence every single day since. There is a particular kind of shock that arrives not as an emotional event, but as a structural recalibration, the moment when the load path you have been calculating against proves to be different from the one that was actually bearing the weight. Daniel had built his understanding of Claire's death on the foundation of its official ruling, not because he believed the ruling, but because the alternative required him to have been the cause of it. Not through action, but through question, through the simple professional act of asking whether the safety standards on a Shelton and Walsh project were being properly documented, which he had done 3 weeks before her car went off Highway 1, with a brake system that a company-affiliated examiner had inspected 14 days prior. He had known on some frequency below articulation for 3 years. The knowing had been why he signed. The knowing had been what the settlement was purchasing, not just his silence, but his understanding that speaking would not bring her back and would only remove the one remaining parent from a 5-year-old who had just lost the other one. He sat with this in the specific way that a load-bearing wall sits after the floor above it, shifts not collapsing, but registering every force with new clarity. The email, Daniel said. His voice was level in the way that things are level when they have been stripped of everything that was obscuring their surface. Do you still have a copy? Holt reached into the bag beside his chair and produced a hard drive. It was the kind of small portable device that could hold a significant archive, and it had the worn quality of something that had been handled frequently. Everything I had access to before the lockout, the email chain, the original inspection reports, versus the filed version's internal memos. I encrypted it the night before I signed. He placed it on the table between them. I kept it because it was the only thing I had. And I didn't use it because using it would have meant choosing a fight I didn't think I could win alone. He looked at Daniel. You're not alone. That's different. Daring to be honest when it costs everything that is not the same as being unafraid. Daniel had been afraid for 3 years. Tonight in a rain-wet building in Portland, with a hard drive on the table between him and a man who had been waiting just as long for someone to arrive and make the asking worthwhile, he felt the fear clearly enough to name it and act past it anyway. Sarah Vance extended her hand across the table. Chain of custody starts right now. Her voice had the brisk efficiency of someone activating a protocol. David has the legal framework. Sandra Pierce in San Francisco is expecting the file. We fly back tonight. The flight back was dark above the cloud layer, the coast below invisible, the lights of the Central Valley scattered at the margins of what could be seen. Daniel held the hard drive in his jacket pocket alongside the stuffed bear, two objects of entirely different weights, carrying entirely different kinds of significance, and stared out the small oval window at the absence of ground. He thought about Lily asking whether it was the dangerous kind or the careful kind, and he thought about the fact that those two categories had stopped being mutually exclusive approximately 18 hours ago. He thought about Claire reading the load specifications on a development project and catching a number that his team had not flagged, and about the specific injustice of a person like that being someone else's loose end. He thought about Frank Shelton making a call to Garrett Willis 9 days before Highway 1. Then his phone buzzed with Sandra Pierce's name on the screen. The message was 4 sentences. Frank Shelton had entered Harlow Tower at 11:47 p.m. using a keycard with Carol Whitfield's credential signature. The building's access system logged him to the executive floor. Sandra had remotely locked the elevator service and the primary stairwell exits when the anomaly triggered. Frank was in the building and could not leave through any standard route. She had identified his likely objective from the access log, the executive suite, specifically the workstation assigned to Ryan Calloway. The digital forensics team she had mobilized at 10 p.m. had prepared for this contingency. Ryan's workstation had been flagged for monitoring, and at 2:17 a.m., it had received a file transfer from an external device that had not been there at midnight. The file contained documentation that to a journalist or investigator, encountering it without context would construct a coherent narrative of Ryan Calloway as the architect of a plan to eliminate Meg Harlow and destabilize the Houston deal for the benefit of a competitor. The metadata was crafted. The trail was built. Frank Shelton's Plan B was not the work of a man operating from desperation. It was the work of a man who had maintained a contingency from the moment Plan A was put in motion, who had understood that the primary approach might fail and had invested equivalent preparation in the alternative. Sandra's second message arrived 12 seconds after the first. He still has his laptop. I've blocked the executive Wi-Fi. He may attempt cellular hotspot. Land as fast as possible. I need you here. Sarah Vance had already told the pilot. The aircraft banked and Daniel felt the change in trajectory in his body before he processed it consciously. While they were in the air in the building where Daniel had cleaned floors for 11 months, Carol Whitfield had asked to speak with Meg Harlow. Sandra had relayed this via a separate thread. Carol had arrived at the executive suite at 8 in the evening and had waited with the particular quality of waiting that belongs to people who have decided to do something irreversible and are holding themselves in the preparatory stillness before the decision activates. She had asked for a private conversation. Meg had said, "Conference room B, Sandra present." Carol had not objected. What she told them was a case study in how a person who is not a criminal becomes useful to one through the ordinary love of family. Frank had called her 3 weeks before the morning of the boys and coffee. He had asked questions that she had categorized as a brother's concern for a significant business relationship. Meg's schedule, the texture of her mornings, who besides Meg had access to the executive level early in the day. Carol had answered. She had her own key card, her own access. Frank had her home address and had visited 3 weeks prior, ostensibly to talk about their mother's estate. Her spare key card had been in her home office desk drawer. It was not there when she checked after the incident. She had retained a lawyer before coming to the building. She had spent 36 hours with that lawyer, understanding the precise dimensions of what she had done and what she had not done, and she had arrived at Meg Harlow's executive suite with the clear understanding that she was not there to minimize or negotiate. She was there because Frank had called her the previous night from a number she did not recognize, and he had been drinking, and he had said that Ryan Calloway was going to absorb everything, and that all she needed to do was stay quiet. It was the stay quiet that had ended it. She had heard that instruction before in a different context when she was 24, and he was 32, and there had been a situation at the family business that their parents had preferred not to examine too closely. She had stayed quiet then. She understood standing in her kitchen at 11:30 at night with her brother's voice on the phone that she was being asked to extend the quiet indefinitely in the way that quiet always extends when you do not choose the moment to end it. She had come to Meg instead. The aircraft descended through the cloud cover and the lights of San Francisco appeared below the familiar geometry of the bay, the bridge. The grid of streets that Daniel had navigated for 3 years in a life he had constructed specifically for its lack of visibility. He looked at it from above, the way you look at a structure you design and when you are approaching it from the outside for the first time, able to see the whole shape of it at once, including the places where the load was not being carried the way you thought. Marcus was at the private airfield with the sedan running. He drove without asking questions, which was one of the qualities Daniel had come to appreciate about Marcus in the compressed period of their acquaintance. At the first red light, Daniel sent Lily a text landing safe, home before school. The response came back in 6 minutes, which meant she had been awake at 1:17 in the morning and had her phone in her hand, and it said, "I knew." Not "I told you so," or "I was worried," or any of the other things it could have said. It said "I knew" with the specific confidence of a child who has decided to believe in the people she has chosen to believe in, and that confidence was more weight than Daniel could carry and more fuel than he had expected to find. San Francisco at 4:30 in the morning has a particular quality of stillness that is not peace but suspension, the city holding itself between the last of what happened yesterday and the first of what will happen today. Everything unresolved, everything possible, the outcome of nothing yet determined. Daniel drove through it with a hard drive in his jacket pocket and the specific alertness of a man who has not slept and has stopped pretending that sleep was the relevant priority. Harlow Tower appeared through the windshield with the same composed verticality it always presented. Daniel had looked at this building from the outside 400 and something times without once registering the engineering decisions that held it up. He registered them now. He was thinking about load distribution and about the specific category of structural failure that occurs not when the material gives out, but when the load path was miscalculated from the original design. When the force you thought was going one direction was actually going another, and the whole building has been compensating without anyone's knowledge until the compensation reaches its limit. Sandra Pierce met him in the lobby with the focused economy of a person who has been working for 6 hours and has converted the fatigue into a kind of fuel. She briefed him while they moved toward the elevator. Frank Shelton was on the 70th floor northeast quadrant in the secondary corridor between the auxiliary conference rooms. The stairwell exits on that floor had been locked remotely at 11:58. The elevator service had been suspended on a selective basis. Frank had his laptop and had not been idle. The executive Wi-Fi block had held, but at 1:47 a.m., her monitoring software had flagged a cellular data transmission from the floor. A hotspot brief, 31 seconds. Not long enough to send everything. Possibly long enough to send something. The file on Ryan Calloway's workstation had been cataloged, photographed, and sequestered by Sandra's digital forensics person in the 2 hours since its discovery. The preliminary read was clear. The files had been created on a device that was not and had never been assigned to Ryan, and the access credentials used to transfer them were Ryan's login obtained through a credential harvesting tool that required physical proximity to his workstation to deploy. The cellular transmission, Daniel said as they stepped into the service elevator. What's your read on it? 31 seconds is enough to send a text with an attachment. She pressed the button for the 70th floor without hesitation. My contact at the Chronicle tells me nothing came in from an anonymous source last night. That covers the obvious venue. It does not cover all venues. The 70th floor corridor was empty and lit on the reduced overnight schedule, every third fixture active, casting the space in a pattern of illumination and shadow that made the distances longer than they were. 3 of Sandra's security personnel were positioned at intervals professional, still maintaining sightlines without broadcasting urgency. Frank Shelton was exactly where Sandra's last report had placed him, seated on the floor of the northeast corridor, with his back against the wall and his laptop open on his knees, a man who had run the calculations and arrived at a result he could not dispute. He was 58 years old and was wearing what had once been an expensive suit that now carried the evidence of a night spent in places a suit of that quality was not designed for. He looked smaller than the version of him that had existed in Daniel's mind for 3 years. Not physically smaller, but dimensionally the way anything looks when you finally see it from the same altitude instead of the altitude of your own fear. He looked up when they came around the corner, and the first thing his face showed was not defiance, but exhaustion. The defiance arrived approximately 2 seconds later, assembling itself with the practiced speed of a man who had spent decades managing the impressions he made, but it assembled over a foundation that was no longer solid, and both of them could tell. His eyes moved from Sandra to her team to Daniel, and at Daniel they stopped. The recognition was immediate and produced a response that moved through Frank Shelton's face in the way that certain truths move through a person who has spent considerable effort not looking directly at them, sudden and total and reorganizing. He said one word, Cole, and Daniel said Shelton. Sandra moved forward with her team, positioning to her flanks, and Frank's hands came up from the laptop in the gesture of a man who was communicating compliance before anyone asked for it. He was not armed. He had been a person who solved problems with instruments of documentation and institution rather than with anything physical, and even now cornered on a building floor at 4:30 in the morning, the instinct was to reach for paper and language and the levers of plausible deniability rather than anything that would make the situation physically complicated. Whatever you think you have, he began, in the register of a man who has not yet fully accepted that the register is no longer relevant. We have the workstation file with its metadata. Sandra cut through it with the clean efficiency of someone who has made this particular speech before and has reduced it to its necessary components. We have your entry log using a key card that is not yours. We have 47 hours of phone record analysis showing your communication pattern with Ryan Calloway. We have a whistleblower in Portland whose NDA has been superseded by a federal immunity agreement. We have the colorimetric and laboratory confirmation on the coffee from the Summit conference room. She paused. And we have the cellular transmission you sent at 1:47 this morning, which I'm going to give you the opportunity to explain before I characterize it to the law enforcement personnel who will be here in approximately 40 minutes. Frank Shelton's composure did not break. It deflated a subtler and more total process like a structure that has been under pressure releasing rather than failing. He looked at the laptop on his knees, and then he looked at Daniel, and the calculation he was running was visible in the quality of his attention, even from 8 feet away. The transmission went to a dead drop. His voice had shed the management register and arrived at something flatter and more honest. An account I set up 3 months ago. No active recipient. He looked at Sandra. It didn't go anywhere. I panicked when the hotspot window closed and I couldn't reconnect. I've been sitting here for 3 hours understanding that it's done. Sandra's expression registered this and moved past it without ceremony. Then we're going to stand up slowly, leave the laptop where it is, and walk to the elevator together. Frank did not move immediately. He was looking at Daniel with the specific quality of attention that one person gives another when they have been carrying something that belongs to that other person and have not yet decided how to put it down. Daniel made the decision for both of them. I'm not going to ask you anything in front of a legal proceeding. He held Frank's gaze with the steadiness of a man who has spent the night crossing a distance that took him 3 years to begin. I'm not recording this. I'm not going to characterize whatever you say as a statement. I need one answer that I am owed, and then Sandra's team can do what they need to do. Something shifted in the older man's posture, the specific shift of a person who recognizes that they are being offered a form of dignity they have not earned and are not in a position to refuse. Claire. The name arrived in the corridor and occupied it the way that some names occupy a space completely and with weight that the surrounding air has to reorganize around. My wife, I need to know if the order was yours. 11 seconds of silence. Daniel counted them. He was an engineer and he had always counted things under pressure because numbers held their shape when other things did not. Frank Shelton looked at the floor of the corridor. Then he looked up and what was on his face was not contrition. It was something more specific and less forgivable than contrition, the expression of a man who has known for 3 years that this conversation was eventually coming and had not found in all that time an adequate way to prepare for it. The order was to stop her from coming to the office. She had called 2 days before, left a message with my assistant saying she had documentation she wanted to discuss. I didn't know what she had. I told Willis to make sure she couldn't keep the appointment. His voice was flat in the way of a man reading from a prepared statement he composed for himself years ago. What he did on Highway 1 was not what I instructed. I want you to understand that distinction. I understand the distinction, Daniel said. I want you to understand it doesn't function as a defense. Frank looked at him. No, it doesn't. And then quietly, with the quality of a thing that has been held in compression for so long that its release is barely audible. I am sorry, I know that is nothing, but it is the only thing I have that is actually mine to give you. There is a specific moment in the life of a grief that has been structured around not knowing when the not knowing ends. It does not feel the way that dramatic convention suggests, not cathartic, not releasing, not the completion of an arc that the mind had always been moving toward. It feels like the removal of a load that you did not know was altering your posture until it is gone and you feel the strange new balance of standing without it. The grief remains. Claire remains gone on Highway 1 in the October of 3 years ago. But the shape of the grief changes when the unknowing is removed from it, and the new shape, though not easier, is at least honest. Daniel stepped back. He nodded once to Sandra, and Sandra's team moved forward, and Frank Shelton stood from the floor of the corridor with the stiffness of a 58-year-old man who has spent a night sitting on hard surfaces, and he went with them without resistance. As they reached the elevator, he stopped and turned once more. Willis is in Reno. He's been there since the month after it happened. He's using the name Gary Walton. He held Daniel's gaze for the last time. You didn't hear that from me in any official capacity, but you didn't need to because I'm going to say it again on the record in 40 minutes. The elevator doors closed between them. Sandra worked the phones for the next 2 hours with the efficiency of someone who has spent a career preparing for mornings that required this kind of rapid institutional activation. The FBI field office was notified. The San Francisco Police Department's Major Crimes Division was briefed with the specific relevant framework, the attempted homicide, the falsification of the earlier investigation, the existence of a named suspect in Reno, Nevada. A warrant application for Garrett Willis was in process before the sun had fully committed to rising. Ryan Calloway arrived at the building at 7:15 because Ryan Calloway was a man who had spent 4 years demonstrating his work ethic through early arrival and had not found a way to stop that habit even in the circumstances of the current week. He was met by Sandra in the lobby, and taken directly to the 14th floor, where the situation was explained to him with the document trail displayed on a screen that left no interpretive room. The planted files, the metadata, the credential, harvesting the architecture of the frame that Frank Shelton had built around him. He sat with it for a long time. His hands were on the table and very still, and he looked like a man doing the specific arithmetic of understanding that the person he had thought he was protecting from embarrassment had been constructing a version of events in which he would be the one who faced consequences for a murder attempt he had nothing to do with. The friendship examined from this angle was revealed as a series of extractions that Ryan had categorized as conversations. He used me as the delivery mechanism, Ryan said, not to anyone in particular, more in the manner of a person narrating their own understanding as it forms. The coffee, he knew I sometimes came in early. He knew I had a habit of doing things for Meg when I found her already working. He manufactured a version of thoughtfulness that he could point to and say, "There is your man." He manufactured it out of real material, Sandra said, which is how these things work. He didn't invent your friendship. He just built a room around it and waited. Ryan Calloway would spend months after this understanding that the lesson was not about Frank Shelton, but about the gaps in his own scrutiny, the places where he had accepted comfortable narrative in place of examined truth. He would come back to work in 7 weeks after the investigation had cleared him formally and completely. He would be different at it, not worse, but different in the specific way that people are different after they have learned what the blind spots in their peripheral vision cost them. Carol Whitfield came in voluntarily at 8 a.m. with her attorney. The cooperation she provided over the following 4 hours was comprehensive and delivered with the particular quality of a person who has decided that the only remaining self-respect available to them is full honesty. The FBI's assessment was that she had not knowingly participated in the attempt on Meg Harlow's life, and the distinction between being useful to someone and being complicit with them, while not morally clean, was legally significant. She retained her freedom. She did not retain her position on the board because she submitted her resignation before anyone asked for it. She established a small fund for whistleblower legal support out of the proceeds from the sale of her Harlow Technology shares. It was not a large fund. It was the right size for what it was, not an attempt to purchase absolution, but a person directing the resources most connected to their failure toward the thing most likely to prevent the same failure in someone else's future. The FBI warrant for Garrett Willis was executed in Reno, Nevada at 2:17 that afternoon. He had been living there for 31 months under the name Gary Walton, working intermittently for a landscaping company, maintaining the specific low visibility of a person who understands they are in the aftermath of something serious and has no particular plan for resolving that situation other than duration. The arrest was procedural and without incident, which is how arrests go when the person being arrested has been waiting for them for 31 months and has run out of the energy required to believe the waiting will eventually resolve in their favor. Daniel was not in the building when any of this happened. He had left at 7 a.m. When Sandra confirmed that everything requiring his physical presence had been completed and he had driven home in the sedan with Marcus and had stood for a long time in the shower of his apartment in the Sunset District, because there is a kind of exhaustion that lives in the specific layer between the skin and the muscle, and that hot water addresses more effectively than sleep. Lily was still asleep when he got home. He stood in the doorway of her room and looked at her with the particular combination of feelings that does not have a name, not happiness, not relief, but something that sits at the intersection of gratitude and loss, and the ongoing responsibility of being the person that one specific small human is counting on to keep showing up. He did not wake her. He made coffee from the sealed container in the cabinet. He still checked the seal, and he still noted that he was checking it, and he accepted that both of those things were probably going to be true for a long time. He sat at the kitchen table and he slept for 3 hours in the chair, which was not the sleep that the bed would have given him, but was the sleep that was available, and he took it. She found him there when she came out at 8:30, and she looked at him the way she looked at all unexpected things, with a suspended assessment of someone taking inventory before responding. She made herself cereal with the quiet competence of a child who has been managing her own breakfast since she was 6 because some mornings her father needed the sleep, and she had understood this without being told. She ate it standing at the counter, watching him sleep. When he woke, she handed him a glass of water. "You look better," she said. "The scary kind of tired is gone. This is just the regular kind. He drank the water. You can tell the difference. You always can with the people you know. She climbed onto the chair across from him, pulling her knees to her chest. Tell me what happened. The real version. So he did. Not all of it. She was 8 years old, and 8-year-olds were entitled to be protected from the full weight of what adults did to each other in the service of profit and fear. But enough. He told her that the man who had been responsible for what happened on Highway 1 had been identified and was now in custody, and that the people who had protected him afterward had been identified as well, and that the systems designed to address these things were now doing their work. He told her that her mother had not died in an accident, that Claire Cole had been a woman asking questions and keeping documentation about things she had witnessed through her professional life, and that someone with a great deal to lose had found that threatening enough to act on, and that the acting on it had been the worst and most irreversible consequence of a much longer pattern of choices. Lily listened. She was very still in the way she was still when she was not performing. Stillness, but simply inhabiting it naturally, and her face had the quality of a child processing information that is large and must be turned to be seen from all sides before it can be accommodated. So it wasn't random, she said finally. No, that's worse and better at the same time. She thought about this with the scrupulous honesty she had applied to everything since she was old enough to distinguish between those two states. Worse because someone chose to do it. Better because it means she wasn't just unlucky. It means she was brave enough to do something that someone was scared of. He could not speak for a moment. The precision of it, the exact way Lily had mapped the thing, the way she had found the true orientation of it, without anyone helping her navigate, was so specifically clear that the grief and the love arrived simultaneously and with equal force, and he simply held both of them and let them be what they were. Mom was brave, he said when he could. Lily nodded once with the finality of someone recording something in a permanent register. I know. I'm going to be brave like her. She paused. I'm also going to be smart about it. She got brave before she got safe. I'm going to try to do both at the same time. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it without pulling away, which was the specific grace that children extend to their parents at the moments when the need is obvious and they are generous enough to meet it. 3 weeks passed. The investigation expanded in the way that investigations do when a well-maintained structure of concealment is finally open to scrutiny, not in a single dramatic revelation, but in a cascade of smaller ones, each one exposing the space behind it. The FBI's review of James Holt's hard drive produced documentation of practices at Shelton and Walsh that predated the Harlow technology relationship by 4 years. 7 additional employees were identified as having received settlement and NDA packages under materially similar circumstances to Holt's. The commercial development in the South of Market District that had been built on the falsified inspection reports was subjected to an independent structural review, which found several concerns requiring remediation. Nothing that had yet caused harm, but several things that had been quietly waiting for the conditions that might reveal them. Frank Shelton was charged with attempted homicide conspiracy and multiple counts of corporate fraud. His attorney negotiated the addition of cooperation on the Garrett Willis case, which was accepted. He would spend the considerable remainder of his functional years in a federal facility in Central California. James Holt called Daniel from Portland on the Saturday of the second week. He sounded like a man who had been inhabiting a smaller version of himself for so long that the return to full dimensions was disorienting. The whistleblower protection attorney had connected him with 3 other former Shelton and Walsh employees who were now prepared to speak, and he had agreed to act as a coordinating contact for that process, which gave the thing that had cost him so much a function beyond the cost. He said he slept better. He said he had applied to have his engineering license reinstated. He said, "Thank you for coming to Portland. I couldn't have said it to a lawyer. I needed to say it to someone who already knew." Daniel told him that was what it had been designed for, and that the knowing had gone in both directions. The coffee shop on Valencia Street was Meg Harlow's suggestion, which Daniel registered as a shift in operational paradigm from the week in which she had controlled every spatial variable of their interactions out of security necessity. It was a small place with mismatched chairs and a counter that displayed baked goods behind glass, with the studied artlessness of somewhere that did not need the visual marketing because the regulars already knew. She was there when he arrived in the specific way of someone who has learned that arriving first is a form of control and cannot easily unlearn it, even when control is not the current objective. She had bought 2 coffees. She slid one across the table when he sat a sealed paper cup with a cardboard sleeve purchased from the counter. In his direct sightline, his name written on the side in the marker the barista used. He looked at it. He looked at her. And despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, he laughed. Not the careful, partial expression he had been managing all his adult life, but something that came from further in, unguarded and genuine, the laugh of a man who has been surprised by the specific thoughtfulness of another person and does not have a prepared response for it. First time, she said something shifting in her expression, not a softening exactly, but the lowering of a particular kind of deliberate ambient temperature. I wasn't sure you knew how to do that. I'd forgotten, he said. It takes more than I've had available for a while. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him in the way that she looked at things when she was not performing, the genuine attention of a person who is interested in what is actually in front of them. I want to talk about the consulting contract, the formal version, the term Sandra has prepared, but I also want to talk about the infrastructure division. He had been briefed by Sandra on the broad shape of what was coming. Harlow Technology was restructuring its contractor relationships from the ground up, an exercise that, given the extent of the Shelton and Walsh contamination of the existing project pipeline, required someone with the engineering credentials to evaluate every existing structural commitment and the specific experience of having learned at considerable personal cost what it looked like when those evaluations were being falsified. I'm 3 years out of practice, he told her. You identified sodium cyanide by smell in a conference room at 6 in the morning. Her voice was dry in the way of someone pointing out a logical inconsistency. I'm not concerned about your instincts. The technical currency is something we can address. I have 3 senior engineers who will work alongside you while you get current in a training budget that is not being calculated against your salary. She paused. What I cannot find anywhere in this city or the cities adjacent to it is someone who will walk into a design review and say this load path is wrong and the client's timeline is not my reason to sign off on it any one way. The work that a person loves has a specific gravity that is different from the gravity of work that a person is merely good at. Daniel had been good at staying invisible, and he had been good at cleaning floors, and he had been more useful to this building in his 11 months of practice in visibility than anyone in it had known to acknowledge. But the work he had loved, the calculation and verification of structures that people would live inside, the professional responsibility of being the person who was certain that the math was right before anyone's life was entrusted to the result, that had a gravity of a different order, and he felt it now in the quality of his own attention, the way everything in this conversation had a particular sharpness that the previous 3 years had largely lacked. Lily's school year ends in June, he said. I'd like to talk to her about it first. It's a different life. It is. She did not say it like a sales point. She said it like a fact that carried its own implications and required being named as such. Different hours, different exposure, different people wanting things from you. A beat. Different from cleaning floors and also different from the version of yourself you were before that. I know. She looked at him carefully. Is that a problem? He thought about the version of Daniel Cole who had negotiated himself into invisibility, who had made the perfectly reasonable calculation that the best protection for a 5-year-old whose mother had just died was a father who did not present a visible target and who had been wrong in the most fundamental way, not about the threat, but about the mechanism by which people are protected. You did not protect the people you loved by becoming undetectable. You protected them by becoming the kind of person who understood the nature of the threat and was willing to stand in front of it. No, he said, it's not a problem. There was a quality to the silence that followed that was not the silence of a business conversation resting at a natural pause. It was the specific texture of 2 people who have been in a situation of considerable intensity together and who are now in a different situation and are both aware of the transition without performing any particular response to it. I'm not good at this, she said. The directness of it, delivered with the same precision she applied to quarterly projections, was more honest than anything social convention would have produced. I've spent 4 years building a version of myself that is very good at knowing what every room I walk into needs from me. And I'm aware that this is a different kind of room. She looked at the coffee cup in her hands. I'm also aware that most people who interact with me are aware of what I represent institutionally and what I have access to, and that you demonstrated in the first 6 minutes of our acquaintance that you make your decisions without reference to those factors. You were a person who was about to drink something that would have killed her, Daniel said. Everything else was secondary data. Something in her expression, the particular controlled quality that she wore as both protection and professional instrument, allowed a small shift. Not the removal of it, a loosening the way a well-built structure can flex under load without failing, the flex itself being evidence of good design rather than weakness. She stood to leave, gathering her jacket with the smooth economy of someone always oriented toward the next thing. At the door, she paused, the slight hesitation of a person checking themselves against something internal. Meg, he said. She turned. The Monday after next. I'd like to bring Lily to the site walk on the Denver project. She's been reading about the geology of the Front Range, and she has opinions about the foundation specifications that I think are actually worth hearing. The response that crossed her face was neither the CEO expression nor the carefully modulated professional warmth she deployed in managed situations. It was simpler and less constructed than either of those things, the expression of a woman who had not expected to be surprised by the particular shape of this offer and was not prepared to be efficient about her response to it. Monday after next, she said, 8 a.m., and then with the very slight curve of something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. Tell Lily to bring her notes on the geology. The afternoon outside the coffee shop was the specific golden quality of San Francisco in the hour 4 the fog comes back, and Daniel walked through it with the bearing of a man who has set down something heavy and has not yet fully adjusted to the change in how he carries himself. The city looked like itself, complicated and particular, and indifferent to whether anyone found it legible. He had lived in it for 3 years from the vantage point of its edges, the early morning corridors and the commuter routes and the margins of other people's consequential days. He was going to have to learn a different relationship with it. He was prepared for that. 6 months later, the Denver project was in its third phase, and the Front Range geology had, as Lily had predicted, complicated the foundation specifications in a way that required 2 rounds of revision and would ultimately produce a design that was better for having been challenged. The sustainable housing development, 490 units across 3 buildings, built for families whose median income did not accommodate the option of leaving the city, was going up with the specific quality of careful construction that does not announce itself because it is not designed to announce itself. It is designed to last. Daniel's office on the 68th floor of Harlow Tower was not an executive office. It was a working space with a drafting table and 2 monitors and a window that looked west toward the ocean, and it had the particular atmosphere of a room where things were regularly resolved rather than performed. The stuffed bear occupied a corner of the desk because Lily had placed it there on the day she came to see the space and had not offered any explanation for the placement, which was explanation enough. He was reviewing the foundation spec revisions when Sandra Pierce knocked on the open door with the brisk purposefulness that characterized all of her movements. She had the specific expression she wore when she was reporting something that she considered satisfactory from a professional standpoint. The Reno case resolved this morning, she said. Garrett Willis entered a plea, 15 to 25. He cooperated on 2 additional cases from his time at Shelton and Walsh that we didn't know about. She paused. The DA's office says the full picture of what Frank was running goes back further than anyone had estimated. 11 years. A lot of people whose situations are going to get a second look. He took this in and nodded once. Does James Holt know? His attorney called him this morning. He's apparently applied to 3 firms in Portland. One of them called him back the same day. She looked at the room around her with the assessing quality of someone who has spent a career in spaces used for security purposes and was noting that this one was being used for something different. You're good here. I'm good. She nodded in the way she nodded at things she approved of without being effusive about her approval. The thing about this building, she said with the air of someone arriving at a thought that had been in process for a while, is that it took a janitor to show the rest of us what we were missing. She moved toward the door. We should probably have had better awareness before it came to that. The interesting things are always visible, Daniel said. Most people just don't have a reason to look at the floor. After she left, he turned back to the foundation specifications. They were good, they were almost right. There was one calculation in the northeast section that was making a structural assumption he did not agree with, and he was going to have to explain for the second time in 3 weeks why the comfortable timeline and the safe answer were not the same answer, and why he was going to need 2 more days to be certain, rather than 1 day to be probably fine. He had been good at probably fine. He was done with it. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily. A photograph of her notebook opened to a page of calculations about cantilever mechanics that she had been working through for a school project with a note at the bottom. In her careful handwriting, "Does this check out?" He looked at the calculations. They were nearly right. She had made one assumption that was not quite load-bearing, but that would propagate into errors downstream if it wasn't corrected now. He texted back almost. "The third line has a sign error. Fix that, and the rest holds." Her response arrived in 40 seconds. "I knew it felt wrong. I just wanted to make sure I was reading it right." There is a version of the story that ends with the resolution of the large things, the arrest, the conviction, the case closed, and the people accountable, and the institutional changes made. That version is true and accurate and important. But the story that Daniel Cole had been living for 3 years and would continue to live in the mornings when he drove his daughter to school, and in the evenings when they argued about whether the nightlight was still necessary, and in the moments when he caught himself checking the seal on a coffee container and understanding that this was going to be a permanent habit, was a smaller and more durable story than any of those resolutions. It was the story of a man who had decided that the safest place for himself and his daughter was the periphery where nothing could find him, and who had discovered in the sharp specific light of a poisoned cup and a hated name and a hard drive full of things that could not be unknown that the periphery was not safety, it was only distance. And distance, unlike the real structural integrity of a thing built right, provided no actual protection when the load arrived. You do not protect the people you love by making yourself invisible to everything, including the things that matter. You protect them by being willing to be seen, which requires first deciding that you are worth seeing. This was the lesson that had cost Daniel Cole 3 years of practicing his own erasure, and the learning of it had required losing a cup of poisoned coffee and a night flight to Portland and a conversation on a coal floor with a man who had spent 11 years assuming that other people's silence was the same as consent. He would teach engineering ethics at a community college in the evenings on Thursdays beginning in the fall because Rachel Monroe, who ran the program, had asked, and because Lily had heard about the offer and told him that teaching something was the proof of understanding it in a different way than just doing it. He would go because she was right. He would go because the 22-year-old structural engineering students sitting in that classroom deserved to hear before they had built their careers on the wrong load path that the calculation they would never regret making was the one they made honestly, regardless of what the client's timeline had to say about it. He put his phone down and picked up the foundation specifications and found the page with the northeast section and drew a line through the assumption he did not believe in. He wrote in the margin in his careful engineer's hand, "We need to confirm this before we proceed." And then, because it seemed relevant to record, he wrote the principle underneath it. Being careful and being safe are not the same thing. Being safe is what you are when the structure is right. Being careful is how you build it so that it is.